Chapter 1, April. Oil the saws, sharpen axes, learn the names of all the peaks you see and which is highest hoy or Hunderland by heart the drainages between go find a shallow pool of snowmold on a good day, bath in the lukewarm water Gary Snyder, things to do around a lookout. And to the Black Range, forded by snow saved by snow, a view from on high, unsettled by solitude, troubled by wind, some walks with the dog bears we have seen, cutting wood the old-fashioned way, the symbiosis of grass fire. A visit from the meal packers, smoke and thief ghosteropic from the valley of the Rio Grande. The Black Range is only modestly impressive. A low dark wall of irregular height 70 miles long, rising above 10-foot hills. All around are mountains more exposed in their geology, more yielding of their ancient secrets. The muted shapes and dark color of the Black Range give it an appearance of undiminisability, perhaps even unreality, as if it were a painted backdrop in a Loeb Jeff Western. These are not pictocrude parts peaks serrating the sky with sharp shapes of bare rock. Instead, they're a doubtful chimera on the edge of the desert, a sky island seeming to shimmer in an April haze. The Black Range was once a part of Apache country, one of the major reasons it was slow in coming under the domain of the American government. Geronimo was born to the west near the forks of the Gila River. His fellow chief Vittorio, of the Warm Springs Apache, made his home just to the north, at Oyo Caliente, though he knew the Black Range intimately, having used it as a hunting ground and refuge from the summer heat. He and his Chihine followers fought the U.S. cavalry here as late as 1880, and a number of Buffalo soldiers and their Navajo scouts did not have the luck to leave the Black Range alive. Their graves can still be found if you know where to look. For me, the first leg of the trip to the crest is simple and comfortable: a climb on locked pickup trucks, Satchmo on the stereo, my dog Alice on the seat beside me. We glide across the bed of an ancient inland sea, which locals call the Flats. Beyond the little town of Gaylord the road curves to contour with Trout Creek, a stream with sources high in the mountains, denuded in the lower elevations by decades of overraising. At Embry, population 30. The road leaves the creek to begin its climb through the foothills. For 15 miles there is not a straightaway long enough to allow me to pass a slow vehicle. Locals, if they see me come up behind them, will pull into one of the gravel turnouts and offer a wave as I pass. But if I find myself behind tourists, I will dial down my speed and practice the virtues of charity and patience. It is a magnificent drive, and I can hardly fault them for taking it leisurely. I can't help but hurry, despite the sweeping views. Where I'm headed the views are a whole lot better, and besides I've been gone too long. 7 months of hustle in the world below provide more than sufficient acquaintance with the charms of my winter career. But that is behind me no, or rather, I should say, beneath me. Norman MacLean once wrote that when you work outside of a town for a couple of months you get feeling a lot better than the town and very hostile toward it. I felt hostile and superior before I even left. Tending bar will do that to a man, although it also allows him to leave on short notice, and in so doing hurt no one's feelings but those of the regulars who've come to depend on his ear. More than one winter has found me working in a Silver City dive that beckons to the thirsty with a classic neon sign of a cactus in the foreground and a horseman drifting alone into the distance. My most reliable customer was an Oklahoma hillbilly with a Santa Claus beard, whose wit and wisdom is best exemplified by a statement I've heard more than once from his barephone lips. Thing about them Irabbers, they breed faster'n we can shoot 'em. Kinda like them Kennedys. Weekend entertainment brought the biggest crowds and the best money, courtesy of heaving bands with evocative names such as Dirt Nap, Balls Out, and New Mexican Erection. It all makes for an interesting counterpoint to summers spent alone far from town. But I'm tired of playing the role of Enna Blurpies in an unholy chapel. At right saddle my drive is over, though the real pleasures of the journey have just begun. In a supply shack cluttered with helicopter sling nets and cases of militarist item raise meals, I leave 8 boxes to be packed in later by meal, each box marked with its weight, to help the packers balance their animals. The boxes contain books, dry and canned food, dog food, to cases of W batteries, a frisbee, a mop head, a bow saw, an axe bit. I double-check my own pack for all the immediate necessities: maps, binoculars, handheld VUF radio, freeze dairy food, my typewriter, some magazines, some whissies, certain I've left nothing vital behind. I begin the final stretch of what has to be one of the sweetest commutes enjoyed by any hard-working American anywhere. Alice leaps about, wagging her question mark tail. She feels the same way I do. 5.5 miles await me, 5.5 miles of toil and sweat, nearly every inch of it uphill, with 50 pounds of supplies on my back. I can feel right off that winter has again made me soft. My gluteal muscles burn. My knees creak. The shoulder straps on my pack appear to want to reshape the curve of my collarbones. The dog shares none of my hardships. She races to and fro off the trail, sniffing the earth like a pig in search of truffles, while from the arches of my beleaguered feet to the bulging disc in my neck, an old dishwashing injury, the repetitive stress of bending forward with highball glasses by the hundred hurt. Not many people I know have to work this hard to get to work, yet I can honestly say I love the hike. Every step of it. The pain is a toll I willingly pay on my way to the top, for here, amid these mountains, I restore myself and lose myself, knit together my ego and then surrender it, detach myself from the mass of humanity so I may learn to love them again, all while coexisting with creatures whose kind have lived here for millennia. Despite human efforts to the contrary, it remains pretty wild out here. Along the path to the peak, the trail curves atop the crest of the Black Range, first to the west, then back to the east, always heading eventually north. Despite the wild character of the country, there is evidence of the human hand all along the way, not least in the trail itself. An artificial line cut through standing timber, the wilderness boundary speaks of a human imprint. A metal sign nailed to a tree suggests you leave your motorized toys behind. Halfway to the top, the trail passes an exquisite rock wall, handiwork of the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s. When the New Deal put thousands of Americans to work on the public lands of the West, the wall holds the line against a talus slope above it, keeping the loose rock from swamping the trail. 70 years later, the wall is as solid as the day it was built, as is the lookout tower where I'm headed, another Keach project that replaced the original wooden tower built in the 1920s. For a while thereafter, the trail follows an old barbed wire fence, a relic of a time not that long ago when cattle grazed these hills. High on the trunks of old firs and pines hang a few white ceramic insulators, which once carried no 9 telephone line down from the lookout. Having spent something like 1,000 days in this wilderness over the past decade, I've noticed all of these features of the hike many times, and yet there are always surprises. A tree shattered by lightning, a glimpse of a black bear, the presence, in a twist of mountain lion scat, of a tiny mammalian job invadance of the dance of predator and prey. The surprise this time arrives a half-mile below the peak, a stretch of hip-deep snow. It swallows the trail amid an aspen grove on the north slope, and there is no shortcut from here, nothing to do but slog on through. For a few steps I'm fine, the crust holds, then it collapses beneath me, and I post-hole to about midi. I try to lift one leg, then the other, but I feel as if I'm stuck in quicksand. I'm not going anywhere unless I lose my pack. With its weight off my back, I can extricate myself. But there remains the problem of how I'm going to get both it and myself through the next 800 yards, upright onto legs, 220 pounds of flesh and supplies on a vertical axis. I will continue to sink and struggle. The snow is wet and granular, melting fast. In just a few weeks it will be gone, but not yet. There's nothing to do but become a furlage creature, distribute my weight and the weight of my pack horizontally, and crawl. Alice looks at me as if I've lost my marbles. She even barks twice, sensing we're about to play some kind of game. But now when I punch through the surface crust, I don't plunge as deep, and with the aid of my arms I can drag myself along, bit by bit, crow-like up the slope. Alice runs ahead, returns, licks my face. She's a hunk of snow, bolts away again. She's delighted by my devolution to furlage creature. Though I can't say I feel likewise. All I can see from this vantage is an endless field of white broken only by tree trunks, and I possess neither her agility nor her lightness of foot. After a 20-minute crawl, I reach the clearing at the top. Normally I would rejoice in this moment. Home at last, mind and body reunited on the top of the world, but my hands are raw and red and club-like from the cold, and my pants are soaked from crawling in snow. The sun is dropping fast, and with it the temperature. If I don't change clothes and warm up, I'm in trouble. The cabin is filthy with rat shit and desiccated deer mice stuck to the floor, dead moss by the hundreds beneath the windowsills. But these are problems for later. I start a fire using kindling gathered late last year with precisely this moment in mind. I strip off my pants and hop into dry ones, never straying far from the pot-bellied stove. Once I'm warm through, I tend to the next necessity, water. Just outside the cabin is an underground tank, 500 gallons of rainwater captured by the cabin's roof and funneled through a charcoal filter into a surplus-guided missile container. It's the sweetest water I've ever tasted, despite what holds it, and to keep it that way I lock the ground-level lid for the off-season. This winter, I discover, someone tried to get at it and broke off a key in the lock. Why a visitor thought he could open a U.S. Forest Service padlock it is stamped us, unmistakably, is difficult to fathom, but I've spent enough time here to know that people do strange things alone above 10.0 feet. Maybe it's simple lack of oxygen to the brain. My water supply shall remain, for now, inaccessible. The snow I so recently cursed is my savior, melted in a pan on the wood stooped, strained of bits of bark and pine needle. It tastes nearly as sweet as I remember the cistern water, with just a tincture of mineral earth. My thirst quenched and my hands warm. I heat some snowmalt and freeze-dried minestrone to head off the rolling in my stomach. The sun drops over the edge of the world. The wine comes up, gust to near 40. I jam the stove with wood, unroll my sleeping bag on the mattress in the corner, and free fall into untroubled sleep. 5 hours later I wake to find Alice has joined me in the bed. I can't say I mind the added warmth of her next to me. It is still only 2 a.m. but the stove has burned out. I revive the fire from the ashes of itself, drink some more snow water. Outside the wind screams in the night, gusting now to 50, buffeting the cabin like some rude beast up from the desert. I pull on an extra pair of wool socks, a down vest, a stocking cap, gloves. Time for a look around. Some of my fellow lookouts live in their towers, spacious rooms with catwalks around the exterior. My tower is small and spare, 7 by 7, purely utilitarian, more office than home. It can hold for people standing, assuming they're not claustrophobic. At 55 feet tall, it is one of the highest lookouts still staffed in the Gila. It had to be built high to offer sight lines over the trees, my mountaintop being relatively flat, and in my more poetical moods I think of it as my mountain minaret, where I call myself to secular prayer. Near the top the wine grows fiercer. I grasp the handrail, climb the last flight of stairs, shoulder my way through the trapdoor in the floor, and there it is, my domain for the next 5 months, a stretch of earth cloaked in the mystery of dark, where the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts overlap and give out, where mountains 35 million years old bridge the gap between the Southern Rockies and the Sierra Madre Occidental, and where on the plains to my north the high desert influence of the Great Basin can be felt. I am perched on the curving southern spine of the Black Range, with a view all the way up its east side. The range runs almost straight north and south, and for much of its length marks the Continental Divide. The waters on the east flow to the Rio Grande and eventually onto the Gulf of Mexico, while the waters to the west join the Gila River on its 650-mile journey to the Colorado at Yuma, Arizona, a journey it rarely completes, thanks to thirsty Arizonans. Even to drive the circumference of country I can see from here by daylight would take 2 full days plus an international border crossing. It is a world of astonishing diversity and no small human presence. To the east the lights of truth or consequences twinkle like radioactive dust. In the southeast, just beyond the horizon, El Paso and Wares glow like the rising of a midnight sun. Along an arc to my south are the lights of other, for smaller towns, lights that remind me I sit at the juncture of more than one transition zone, not just the meeting of different biomes but the wildland-urban interface. The town lights are quaint and even rather beautiful at this remove, but the wildlands are what draw my eye whenever I climb the tower at night. In a quadrant from due west to due north there is no evidence of human presence. Not one light to be seen, a million uninhabited acres. A line running northwest of where I sit would not cross another human dwelling for nearly 100 miles, a thought that never fails to move me. I say move me, but that doesn't quite do justice to the feeling. In fact, if I'm to be honest about it, on this my first night back in the tower I find myself hopping around like some juiced-up beat poet, but instead of shouting Zen poetry and gentle nonsense I start hollering profanities, turning this way and that trying to take it all in, but it's just so huge there ain't no way. How can I explain this outburst, other than to say no disrespect to the faithful intended? I grew up Catholic, after all. Curse words and states of intense feeling have always seemed to me a natural match. Satisfied with the extent of my elbow room, I drop back through the trapdoor, shimmy down the steps, hurry back to the warmth of the cabin. I feed the pot-bellied stove with pine I split last August. For an hour or more I lie awake in the dark, listening to the howl of the wind in the trees, resisting an urge to call the dog back to the bed and thereby spoil her beyond reckoning. It's a lot of work setting up to be lazy. For 7 months I surrender the cabin to the creatures, if they can get in. This winter they've been aided by a citizen user of the national lands who decided to break a window in the side door. For reasons unknown and unknowable, 5 miles afoot seems a long trip to commit a petty act of vandalism. Every surface is covered in dust from the winter winds working their way through the crevices, blowing in through the window. Not even the dishes in the cupboards are spared a fine grit. All must be washed. I heat some water in a basin for just this purpose. While I wait for it to warm, I cover the window with plastic sheeting and duct tape, measure it for a plexiglass replacement to be hauled up later. Next, all evidence of the rodents must be expunged, especially the smell. I pry the dead deer mice off the floor and throw them in the fire. Dustpans full of moss meet the same fate. The pack rats have made nests in the bedroom cabinets. Filthy conglomerations of pine needles, plastic spoons, band-aids, pages torn from magazines, random playing cards. These too I burn. The rats have the unfortunate habit of urinating in the corners and defecating where they sleep, filling the cabin's atmosphere with a bitter, ammoniac stench redolent of certain New York streets I have known. To ward off hantavirus, I spray the floor with a solution of water and bleach, then mop with water and pine-scented soap, and finally mop once more with just water. Once the place is somewhat livable, I figure I'd better test my radio. Let the below world in on the fact that I have arrived here safely. Not that anyone's all that concerned. Once we're sent up our hills, we lookouts are largely forgotten, which is just the way we like it. Until we see some lightning, we tend to follow the model of Victorian-era children. Do not speak unless spoken to. An exception is this courtesy call to let the office manager know I'm alive, and that my tower withstood another winter of battering wind. I climb a ladder and affix a magnetized antenna to the cabin's roof. I plug a handheld mic running from the antenna into the side of my Bendix King radio. A red light blinks on when I press transmit. Black Range District, Apache Peak. Go ahead, Apache Peak. Just letting you know I'm on the peak safely. All's well here. Copy. Anything you need. Affirmative. Some joker broke off a key in the lock to the cistern. You'll need a bolt cutter for the old lock and a new lock to replace it. Copy that. We'll send those up with the packers. Tell them to wait 2 weeks or they won't get their animals through the snow on the north slope. Will let them know. You stay warm up there if you can. Copy. Apache clear. I rather like the laconic style of these conversations, which results, I often feel, from a kind of mutual incompression errand. The person on the other end can't fathom why I'd spend most of the summer alone in a little tower, far from running water, cold beer, and satellite TV. I cannot conceive of why you'd join the Forest Service only to spend your days shuffling paper under banks of fluorescent light. To him I must seem a little crazy, even something of a masochist, a perception I do nothing to dispel on those rare occasions a couple of times a year, to pick up my radio and turn it back in when I visit the office. Some years ago, when forced to undergo a training and orientation session prior to the beginning of fire season, I raised my hand in protest at having to sit through a seminar on sexual harassment in the workplace. The only conceivable way this affects me, I pointed out, is in my choice of whether to harass myself with my left hand or my right. This heresy was greeted with a gimlet eye and the stern word, not to mention a few muffled chuckles, but it had the desired effect. I was not invited to attend such a session again. The less normal I can make myself appear, the less likely I am to be drafted into some sort of non-lookout work, or any task involving contact with the public in an official government capacity. I must act the part well enough, a goofy hermit with a weird beard and a faraway look in his eyes, because for most of my season I am left utterly and blissfully alone. My radio contact is where he wants to be, I'm where I want to be, and in this fashion we preserve a bit of the diversity of our human experience, not unlike the vigorous diversity of the forest out my window, where the ponderosa at their healthiest grow in open parklands, the trees spaced 50 or 100 feet apart, while the aspen cluster in dense groves with a shared root system. I am not unfamiliar with his world. In fact, I once inhabited a more extreme version of it, for years at a desk, in front of a computer, enclosed by the steel and glass colossi of Lower Manhattan. He at least has a view of mountains out his window, far off in the distance, which trumps the view I once had of Jersey City. I found rather quickly during my peonage in newspapers that I did not have the requisite temperament for such work, the subservience to institutional norms, and that I gained very little in the way of psychic ballast from the attachment of my name to that of a well-known brand in American journalism. Maybe it was a case of egocentricity, but I discovered I had things to say that could not be said in the pages of a daily newspaper. Plus, when the weather cooperates, I prefer to work shirtless. Let there be no illusion about the purity of my solitude. Not only do I see the occasional hiker, but I am here for 10 days followed by 4 days off. This routine will hold for the next 4.5 months. It will take a couple of weeks, depending on the fire danger rating, the Forest Service budget, and the timing of the summer rains. My pilgrimage to town every other weekend allows me a restorative dose of civilized pleasures. I rendezvous with my wife, Mara, take a hot shower, drink a cold beer. I catch up with friends and shoot some pool to keep my game from going entirely to pieces. By about the third day, I am ready to be back in the woods, and come Mizzy's and I will often forego time spent in town and instead with Martha's indulgence. Perhaps even her company grab my fly rod and head for trout streams reachable in no less than half a day's walk. In most ways I have it easier than my predecessors. Once the lookout lived in an earth dugout and hauled water from a spring a half-mile away. When he spotted a fire, he was expected to saddle a horse and ride straight for the smoke, tools at the ready to put the thing out. There was no such thing as a day off. The lookout came in the beginning of the season and stayed until the end. My days off are covered by a relief lookout. I have for sturdy walls and 8 windows, a refrigerator that runs on propane, a mattress flown in years ago by helicopter. The entirety of my duties are 5: report the weather each morning, answer the radio, relay messages when asked, call in smokes when they show, and keep an eye on fire behavior with the safety of crews in mind. This time of year, in the absence of lightning, a smoke is unlikely. If one appears, it will have been caused by humans an abandoned campfire. A cigarette tossed from a car and will appear near a road. The open meadow to my southwest affords me a view, without my climbing the tower, of a good chunk of the roaded country for which I am responsible. A quick glimpse from the tower twice an hour suffices to cover the country to the southeast, south, and west. To the north there are no roads. In these early days, as I work on sprucing up the place, I fulfill the command embedded in my job title and look out maybe 2 hours a day, 15 minutes every hour. That will change with an increase in fire danger, but for now the majority of my time is spent cleaning, cutting wood, sleeping, reading, and cooking, a regime I follow with unyielding discipline. Alice sits in the meadow and gnaws on a mule deer antler she found. She loves and lusts as much as her master and appears to feel no pangs of conscience about doing merely what pleases her. More than one visitor has remarked that she must be the luckiest dog in the world. I can't speak to the experience of all dogs everywhere, but it's true that Alice finds a great deal of joy here. From the moment my backpack emerges from the closet at home, she begins to pace and pant in excitement, her tail working in figure 8s, for she knows what this contraption signals: a trip into the woods. When Martha and I first laid eyes on her, she was an underfed, 8-month-old puppy, locked up in a cage at the dog pound. She was all black except for a white stripe running from her throat to her chest, a coloring that made her appear as if she were always dressed for a black tie affair. When we paused to look in on her, she rose from her grimy and pathetic little bed and gently licked the hands we proffered to pet her. From then on it was only a matter of formalities, paperwork and vaccinations, and the payment of a fee for having her spayed. Once we'd been licked, everything clicked. There were the usual difficulties at first. She'd been on the streets of our town for unknown months, a scavenger's existence, and backed away in skittishness whenever a hand was inadvertently raised above her head. More than once we woke in the morning to find a brown pile or a yellow puddle in the middle of the kitchen floor. When we were gone a portion of the day, she greeted our return by jumping at us with her paws extended, as if she wished to dance. Often this resulted in livid scratches on our forearms, marks of her overzealous need for love. Still, she made steady progress on the path to domestication. She romped agreeably with other dogs in the park, learned to heel and fetch a stick, brought her bodily functions under control. We taught her the other doggy basics: to sit and shake, lie down and roll over, jump and grab a stick in her teeth. She learned what was meant by the words, "Are you hungry?" and her answer, expressed in appraised ears and a quick pirouette toward her food dish, was never "not yes." 9 months into our acquaintance, she learned she had 2 homes, not one, a summer getaway in the hills. She took to the place instantly, and her change in personality was striking. Whereas in town she'd been a timid creature, afraid to step into the yard and do her business when the wind was up. On the peak she'd lie in the meadow all afternoon in a 40-mile-an-hour gale, nestled on the leeward side of the helicopter landing pad. She recovered a streak of independence, wandering off by herself in search of bones, endless small mammals to startle and chase. Mornings when deer came to the meadow she'd run them off. She guarded her territory with a nervy vigilance undermined only by a high-pitched yip almost comical in its lack of menace. Hikers were often startled to hear their approach announced in advance. I found it amusing and even a little exhilarating to watch her regain a touch of her former wildness, that wildness which lies dormant in the hearts of most domesticated creatures. The way she attacked a mule deer antler with ferocious jaws, the way she marked her presence by dribbling a few drops of urine on a bobcat turd. These spoke of atavistic urges, instincts toward survival and even dominance in a world of struggle and strife. Back in town on my days off, she resumed her sedentary existence, napping on the couch all afternoon, begging for the chance to snuggle between her two soft-rated masters. The woods invigorated her, and she intuited the difference between that world and her other, modulating her behavior accordingly. On the mountain she proves an agreeable companion in more ways than one. She never insists on conversation. She requires only a dish of water, 3 squares a day, and a scratch now and then behind the ears, the perfect partner in solitude. When I sign off the radio and descend the tower at 6 p.m, and she's immediately at my side, urging me to take her for a hike. Without her here, I might be tempted to bag my evening stroll, go straight to dinner and whiskey and a ball game on the radio. But her enthusiasm always wins the day, and I'm the better for it. So is she, for she loves to run, loves the pursuit. If you walk in wild country 5 miles a night, you're bound to scare up a creature or 3. In her time she's flushed elk, mule deer, wild turkey, quail, grouse, skunks, and happily rats, squirrels, chipmunks, rats, and mice. More than once we've encountered a bear. The first time, she smelled it before either of us saw it, her nose to the ground, her back up like a razorback hog's. She snorted and growled and offered a lower, more menacing bark than I'd heard from her before. I spoke to her in a soothing tone, using one of the dozen nicknames we'd given her over the years. "It's okay, little spooky one, little spookeen, stick close and we'll be just fine. You and me, spooky grew, yes, that's a girl." Every nerve ending in my body needled my skin as we followed the switchbacks down the northeast slope of the peak, through lovely fir forest and down into aspen, with Alice's ears upraised just a touch, her tail moving back and forth in the shape of a machete. All of a sudden something crashed like a tree on the far side of a little open meadow, except it kept on crashing after itself, ever more softly as it went, like a domino arrangement of trees, each one smaller than the next. Before it was gone I caught a blurred glimpse of its cinnamon back and black rump. Alice took off like a shot, yipping her funny yip, racing toward the meadow, and I called after her, "Hey, hey, 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 hey," and she put on the brakes, skidded in the needle cast, and responded twice, ruff. "Good girl," I said. "Good spook." She held her ground. After a few more gruffs and growls, we kept on our way. Just as she smells things I've yet to see and never may, so I sometimes see things she has yet to smell. Her nose supplements my eyes. My eyes sometimes preempt her nose. One evening we took the faint path north of the peak, out along the Ghost Divide, a series of knolls and ridges leading into some of the wildest country in the Aldo. Locust and gamel oak crowded the trails so that every once in a while it disappeared entirely, discernible only by the blazes on the trees. We made it nearly 3 miles, just above the point where we needed to turn around to make it back to the top by dark, when ahead on the trail I spotted something that looked like a charred stump, except that it was moving and had a tan-colored snout. I turned and looked for Alice, who for once trailed behind me. I softly called her away from her hunt for ground birds. When she pulled up next to me I grabbed her collar, turned her around, and led her back in the direction we'd come, not letting go until I was sure she was with me and understood the seriousness of our intent to retrace our steps. She much prefers the loop hike to returning over ground she's already scoured. By some miracle she neither saw nor smelled the bear. Perhaps just as lucky, the bear did not appear to see or smell us. There are times, early each season, when the solitude unsettles me. I have spent my winter kibsitting with drinkers, after all, a variety of human not known for reticence, night after night of the usual story: problems with women, problems with men, problems with money, problems with kin. A man grows accustomed to nodding his head in feigned sympathy and reaching for the bottle, to gestures that can only in the end corrupt, especially when performed in unison and for money. Following the drift and weave of my own thoughts is no simple task at first. Like any refined art, it begs practice, and I am for the moment out of step. The wine doesn't help. Today's are all it takes for the noise to insinuate itself in my cranium, a fluctuating symphony of sound, whisper and whistle, moan and roar. It gives a texture to the days, gaining power through the afternoon, barreling through the night, easing briefly at dawn. One morning it ceases altogether, and the sudden quiet knocks me out of balance, forces me to recalibrate the terms of the truce I've made with solitude. At sunrise I step gingerly into the meadow to piss, and all the world is still. I do not have to take care with my aim for fear of dribbling all over myself. I wonder, does a snake feel pain when it molts his skin? My shedding of the social world is not without its element of discomfort. Pissing on the naked earth seems, obscurely, to help. So does singing remembered songs by Sam Cooke, Uncle Tupelo, and Hank Williams Jr. On the first calm night I build a bonfire in the stone circle and pace off my unease in the dark, howl a little at the moon, my bottle of whiskey perched on a stump, The moon rises out of the desert, huge and orange and leering like a lopsided jack-o'-lantern, flame and spirits and a weird pumpkin god of the sky, enough, together, to see me through the long cold night. In the morning, reborn once more, I walk. My options are nearly limitless. Official trails and game trails fork in all directions. Every which way is down into variegated forest, trees dead on the ground, dead trees standing shorn of bark, trees corkscrewed by lightning, trees stunted by wind, trees with cankers and knobs, trees clawed by bears, trees grown together from to make one. Giant old fir trees 5 feet in diameter, aspen groves so thick you can't walk through them. On this day I choose the path to the spring. On the north side of the peak I hear the strange descending call of the Montezuma quail, otherwise known as the harlequin quail, for the spiral black and white swirl on the side of the male's head, a queer-looking bird. It often freezes when a human draws near, as if pretending to be a piece of statuary. A person can come within a few feet of it before it rockets into flight. Nearer the spring a turkey gobbles, and I spot a hen lurching away through the trees. Amid a mature aspen grove, just above the spring, I hear the first hummingbird of the season, abroaded, time to make some sugar water and spy on the little creatures while they drink. Time, as well, to cut wood. I figure I have enough to stay comfortable for 7 more days, longer if I get good solar heating through the windows of the cabin in the afternoons, but it's always wise to work ahead. Rain could spoil the cutting for days. Overnight the mercury still drops into the teens. Being situated just inside the wilderness boundary defined by the Wilderness Act as a place where motorized and mechanized machines are forbidden, and man himself is but a visitor, I am forced to use an axe and a handsaw. I've come to enjoy the simple rhythms of my arm moving a blade of metal teeth through pine and fir, and later on the thought of my labor will make me frugal with the resource of warmth. Some years a trail crew will fell a dead tree outside the wilderness boundary just to myself, then buck up the trunk into rounds I can split with an axe. Otherwise I cut mostly down limbs of 6 inches diameter or less, the size of the feeder hole in my stove. In my years here I've picked the ground clean 100 yards in all directions, so the hunt becomes the greater part of the work, the hunt and the haul to the soffers. Lookouts are the most punctual people I've ever known. Each morning we sign on the radio at 8.0 or 9.0, and depending on our set schedule, and because our transmissions are made over a forest-wide frequency, we cannot afford to lose track of time, unless we want to embarrass ourselves to unseen colleagues. Luckily, one lookout's announcement is a kind of wake-up call for all of us. The beauty of it is we could be naked, bleary-eyed, uncaffeinated, just rolling out of bed, and no one would know, as long as we could speak clearly over the radio the name of our mountain and the words in service, at exactly the hour prescribed. At 9:15 we recite our weather observations to the dispatcher. Wet and dry temperatures, percentage of relative humidity, percentage of cloud cover, wind speed and direction, any lightning or precipitation over the past 24 hours. We measure humidity with a nifty tool called a sling psychometer. It holds 2 thermometers, side by side, and a metal casing on the end of a chain. One of the thermometers has a small cloth sleeve over the bowl, which is dipped in water, spun by the chain in the shade of a tree. The thermometers offer to different air temperatures, one wet, one dry. Using a chart calibrated by elevation, you can gauge the relative humidity by the difference between the 2 readings. On those rare occasions when the readings are the same, you have 100% humidity, which you'll have known already since you'll have been twirling your psychometer in the rain. One morning in late April we received the unofficial signal that fire season has truly begun. Around 10:30 a.m. the dispatcher advises all personnel to stand by for the fire weather forecast. The man who recites it sounds as nervous as a grade schooler chosen to read, in front of the class, a story with a few unfamiliar words. The peculiar thing is, only the numbers change. The words remain the same. High pressure, low pressure, relative humidity, upper and lower elevation temps, 20-foot winds, transport winds, mixing height, ventilation category, Haynes index, lightning activity level. It's a morning poem of meteorology, and he never fails to bungle it in the beginning, mispronouncing a few words, audibly clearing the frog in his throat. Eventually he settles in and finds a rhythm. His self-consciousness ebbs, and the language of fire weather begins to sound like a Gary Snyder riff. The delivery is neither sonorous nor sensitive, but he can read. God admit he is predicting atmospheric conditions. He knows the whole forest is hanging on his every word, waiting for the day when the lightning activity level number rises from a 1 no lightning expected to a 3, or even for but day to day. He will never become a more fluid reader. He always falters out of the gate and slowly gains confidence and ends with his dignity repaired, and we are thankful for our poem. And then the holy silence. Time shapes itself around me in that silence. Shape shifts from mistress to shade, caressing and haunting by turn. Days pass in which there is nothing but wind, bending the pines to postures of worship of an unseen god in the east. The sun bores through the glass windows of the tower, solar heating at its essence. The world becomes the evolution of light, the almost imperceptible shift of color in the sky before dawn, the turn from midnight blue to sapphire, the way the mountains move through shades of green and blue and on through purple and black in the evening, the dark blue reefs of cloud in a backlit sky at twilight, a crimson lip at the edge of the world where the sun has gone, like a smear of blood, repairing at dawn in the east. After dark the cosmos glitters gaudily, the planet Venus sharp and bright as a diamond in the west. A full moon spotlights the peak and throws a crisper shadow than in any city, where the light is diffuse and multi-angled. Not one source in the sky. On moonless nights with thick clouds I can't see my hand 3 feet from my face. I step out the door of the cabin for a midnight leak, and mule deer drum down the hill, fading as they go, the drummers invisible in the squid ink dark. Being here alone I may not be my best self, in the social sense of the phrase, but I am perhaps my truest self, lazy, goofy, happiest when taking a nap or staring at the shapes of mountains. My friends back in town often want from me a report on the nature of solitude, on what it does to the mind to spend so much time alone. In these early days, I'd have little to tell them. A few quiet words from Gary Snyder's Lookout Journal guide my days. Fewer the artifacts, less the words, slowly the life of it, an act for naught. My own insights are fragmentary, fleeting. I write something in my notebook and forget it an hour later. I do not so much seek anything as allow the world to come to me, allow the days to unfold as they will, the dramas of weather and wild creatures. I am most at peace not when I am thinking, but when I am observing. There is so much to see, a pleasing diversity of landscapes, all of them always changing in new weather, new light, and all of them still and forever strange to a boy from the northern plains. I produce nothing but words. I consume nothing but food, a little propane, a little firewood. By being virtually useless in the calculations of the culture at large, I become useful, at last, to myself. Seen from above on a topographic map, my peak sits near the tip of an arrowhead-shaped convergence of mountain ranges. The arrowhead, encompassing a couple million acres of the wildest country in New Mexico, aims along a line parallel to the Rio Grande and points toward the Mexican city of Chihuahua. The Wahoo Range, the Black Range, the Mimbres Range, the Cooks Range, the Pino Saldos Range, and the Mogollon Range make up the angled edges of the arrowhead. Its interior is filled out by the Diables, the Jerkies, the Alps, the Loras. Off to my north it's all heavy forest and deep canyons dropping away from the rim of the Black Range, the heart of the Aldo Leopold wilderness, sharp ridges, pink bluffs, dry arroyos, the occasional perennial stream fed by a spring on the lip of a coal rincon. Another lookout brackets the north half of the range, at Monument Mountain, and beyond him I can see both the Guajos and a sliver of the grassy plains of San Agustin. For off to the northeast rise the great volcanic hulks of the San Mateo Mountains, former stronghold of Vittorio, and just over their flank I can make out the Magdalenas. To my south, the pine and fir forest of the high mountains eventually gives way to pin and juniper foothills and finally to desert, with stark sky islands in the distance, the Floridas and the Tres Hermanas, hogbuck-up trust of stubbled rock. To my immediate west are a series of ridges thickly covered in timber and brush, ridges that descend toward the valley of the Rio Mimbres. Along their tops can be seen the scars of old burns, grown back now in aspen and oak, and locust, none of which have yet leafed out, leaving the country in that direction looking rather drab. A charred snag looming up here and there like an iron spire. Beyond the Mimbres another string of mountains rises. The Pino Saldos Range, a lookout sits at its southeast tip, on Cherry Mountain, 25 miles west of me. He watches over my west-facing flanks. I cover his east-facing flanks, and we share a view of the valleys and mesas between us. To the northwest is the roughest country of all, the headwaters of the West Fork of the Gila River. Out that way the mountain ranges crash upon each other like waves, each one higher than the next. The Diables, the Jerkies, the Moglians, a lookout occupies Snow Peak, the highest and most remote such post in all the Gila, just shy of 11.0 feet elevation and 12.5 miles from the trailhead, the creme de la creme of wilderness lookouts. Its presence out there on the horizon evokes in me a perverse and love-a-me probably due to the fact that in all respects it is suppurative to my own peak, bigger, lonelier, farther from the sun-seared asphalt, more intimate with the heavens. The two lookouts there, Sarah and Razak, have a combined 4.5 decades of experience on the mountain, and their best stories are better than mine. For instance, the summer they were airlifted out by helicopter ahead of a fire that burned within 20 feet of their cabins. Slurry drops were required to save it, and they spent the latter portion of that season scrubbing out their cistern, the water in which had turned the color of pink lemonade from the slurry splashed over the cabin's roof. The forest boundary is only 5 miles away to my east. Most of what I can see in that direction isn't forest at all, though occasionally it burns to grass fires, and the private property owners and the Bureau of Land Management are as eager as the Forest Service to know when their turf catches fire. The latter ranch makes up the greater part of the foreground to the east, a 150.0-acre swath of high mesas, broad canyons, and semi-arid grasslands owned by Ted Turner, one of the massive western properties that make him possessor of more private land than any other American. East of the latter ranch spreads the valley of the Rio Grande, running south at the base of the Fra Cristobals and the Caballo Range. Beyond the Caballos, farther east, is a brutal and mostly waterless stretch of desert known for centuries as the Jornada del Miro, or Journey of the Dead Man. This 90-mile length of the old Camino Real, the royal highway between Mexico City and Santa Fe, offer the traveler a relatively flat shortcut around the tortuous side canyons and up and down terrain of the Rio Grande drainage between present-day Las Cruces and Socorro. The trade-offs were oppressive heat in summer, little reliable water for humans and stock, and the ever-present danger of Apache attack. The Jornada del Miro took 3 days to cross if you didn't stop to rest at night, and lacking water, most who took it did not. Beyond the Jornada del Miro I can see the San Andres Range, the mountains responsible for the white gypsum sands of the Tuloro Basin, one of the natural wonders of North America, sculpted by wind and water into sensuously curving dunes, some of them 50 feet high. The gypsum crystals on the east side of the San Andres spread across to hundreds of square miles of nearly pure white desert, open to public visitation at the White Sands National Monument. The White Sands Missile Range sits just north of the monument, off limits to you and me. The missile range serves as a proving ground for some of the U.S. military's most advanced killing tools. It also contains that scarred piece of earth known as the Trinity Site, where man first unleashed on the world the splendors of the bomb. Twice a year Trinity opens to visitors, who can inspect the desert for a new kind of rock, trinitite, which formed when the blast melted quartz and feldspar into green-colored glass. In summary, then, I have a view of spruce fir high country, Ponderosa parkland, pinyon juniper hills, several river valleys, arid grassland mesas, dry arroyos, high desert scrublands, and the occasional fire scar grown back in aspen and locust. Amid it all are contained the birthplace of the wilderness idea and the birthplace of the nuclear age, a landscape overlaid by history with equal parts hope and dread, and plenty enough irony to keep the mind at play through the long afternoons of no smoke. As a lookout in high country, I like to tell people I get paid to look at trees, but the longer I work this mountain, the more I find myself thinking of grass. For millennia, fire and grass worked symbiotically here. Grass brooms, grommas, melies, fescue, all the various bunch grasses native to the region burned quickly and fertilized the soil, whence came fresh grass. Both lightning-caused fires and human-lit burns moved quickly through the forest understory. Trees lived in mature stands where most were hundreds of years old. Ponderosa covered much of the forest in open, savanna-like parkland, with trees widely scattered, surrounded by a sea of grass. Dendrochronology research, the study of tree rings for evidence of climate fluctuation and fire scars, shows that for centuries much of the forest burned once, twice, even several times a decade, until the late 1800s. Then the sheep and the cow arrived in numbers previously unknown. With Geronimo's surrender in 1880, the last of the Apache holdouts were finally subdued, and livestock barons pushed their herds into the most remote corners of the Southwest, searching for good grass on what was left of the open range. Hundreds of thousands of head of livestock swarmed over southern New Mexico, up to the highest reaches of the Gila country. The consequences were shocking and immediate. In 1895, a great flood swept out of the Pinos Altos Mountains and tore through what was then the heart of Silver City. Subsequent floods wreaked even more havoc. Homes, businesses, even famously a grand piano owned by the Justice of the Peace, were washed away in the periodic surges. The town's commercial strip had to be moved 1 block west after the original main street became a 50-foot crevice. The floods having scoured the earth to bedrock, that scar, colloquially called the Big Ditch, can still be seen today. With the coming of the Forest Service at the beginning of the 20th century, two attitudes prevailed: deference to ranchers and disdain for fire. In 1820 skies, the explorer James Ohio Petty had reported being fatigued by the difficulty of getting through the high grass, which covered the heavily timbered bottom of the Gila River drainage. By 1909, Forest Ranger Henry Woodrow noted that in the heart of the Gila, at what today is the point in New Mexico farthest from a road, there were cattle all through the mountains and grass was hard to find. He had to ride his horse a dozen miles to find something on which it could graze. Elsewhere on the forest, sheep were driven from grassy mesas to water sources in the valleys, carving trails where every living thing was trampled. The trailways acted as barriers to the spread of fire. By the middle of the 20th century, much that was wrong with the Gila could be summed up in 6 words: to many livestock, to few fires. The forest had become a scenic pasturing ground for private ranchers, as indeed too much of it remains. On this day, the tax day, April 15, I need only look out my windows to see how far we've come in embracing fire's utility. A line of smoke rises just this side of North Star Mesa, on land once grazed by the Goss Cattle Company, one of the biggest ranching outfits in the history of the Gila. Instead of cows converting grass to protein, fire converts it to ash. Instead of an incident commander marshaling resources to squelch it, this prescribed fire is led by a burn boss. The burn boss directs the movements of men and women walking along a pre-mapped perimeter with drip torches, canisters that pour a mixture of diesel and gasoline out of a nozzle and past an igniter, allowing their users to dribble flames on the ground. The goal is for the fire to catch and begin to move east, burning several thousand acres over the course of a few days, mimicking an ecological function removed from the land for most of the 20th century. It takes a good deal of study and some imagination to see in the mind the mesa as it was once, a lake of grass rippling in the springtime wind, partially colonized now by juniper and various forms of woody scrub. It little resembles the state in which it was first seen by whites and Hispanics. Fire, so the hope goes, will begin to change that fire in its ancient marriage with grass. The two of them conspired against brush. Fittingly, it was Aldo Leopold who first began to tease out the connections among grass, brush, and fire. In 1919, 10 years after arriving in the Southwest, he was appointed assistant district forester on 20 million acres in Arizona and New Mexico, a job that involved oversight of personnel, finances, fire prevention, and roads and trails. He inspected the forest up close, taking long horseback rides on all the reserves in both states. He devised a record-keeping system for inspection tours and wrote detailed memoranda of his findings. What he saw troubled him. Changes could be read everywhere on the land. On the Blue River of the Apache National Forest in Arizona, for instance, widespread erosion had torn out the lush river bottom where settlers once farmed. Trout streams had become waterless ribbons of cobblebar and driftwood. Marshes had been drained by the cutting of glees. Two questions presented themselves to Leopold: what had caused the changes, and what could be done to mitigate them? The prevailing ideology of the Forest Service prized more and loggable timber above all. Measured in board feet and dollars, grazing went hand in glove with timber production. It kept the grass down, limiting the spread of fire. Fire took potential money in the form of timber fees and sent it to the sky in a puff of smoke. With fire removed from the scene, new trees took hold, trees that could one day be cut. Cows and sheep, in this formulation, helped make the timber ripe for the harvest. To sources of revenue, mutually reinforcing, grazing fees and timber fees, a government bureaucrat's dream. Something had gone wrong, though. On his first reconnaissance mission in the Apache, in 1909, Leopold had found 300 people homesteading on the river bottom of the Blue. On his return 12 years later, 90 people remained. The riparian ribbon of life along the river was desiccated. Willows had been torn out by violent floods. Good soil, each inch of which had taken as much as 1,000 years to build, had washed off the hillsides. Leaves scarred the slopes, lacking competition from surface fires flashing through the grass and snuffing saplings. Trees and chaparral were spreading on the benchlands and foothills. More timber, perhaps, but at what cost? Leopold spent weeks at a time in the field. He saw firsthand the condition of the land, and everywhere he went he looked hard for answers. Grazing appeared the obvious culprit. There were a series of extraordinary reports and articles in the early 1920s. We can follow the evolution of Leopold's thinking as he put forth theories to explain what he saw. In 1920, he wrote dismissively of the notion that fire could have any positive impact. Pewed forestry, he sneeringly called it. a form of primitivism and an insult to his scientific cast of mind. In the course of a few pages in Southwestern magazine, he got everything we've subsequently learned about fire ecology dead wrong. For years later, he was a little less sure of himself. He had studied tree rings and burned over juniper stumps, becoming a pioneer in the use of dendrochronology to determine fire history, and was puzzling over whether grasslands were the climax vegetation, aided by fire, or just a phase through which the land passed on its way to a different climax of deciduous scrub and dense brush oak manzanita, mountain mahogany. He got this wrong too, at least for a while, but of the changes and their cause he had no doubt, as he wrote in the Journal of Forestry. Until very recently we have administered the forests on the assumption that while overgrazing was bad for erosion, fire was worse. In making this assumption, we have accepted the traditional theory as to the place of fire and forest in erosion, and rejected the plain story written on the face of nature. In an article that same year for Sunset magazine, he went so far as to note that in an arid climate such as the Southwest, any grazing at all, even of the most conservative kind, would likely produce erosion. For a high-ranking member of the Forest Service, this amounted to apostasy. To this day, stubborn advocates of public lands ranching refuse to hear of it. Needless to say, the answer is not as simple as removing all the cows and torching the mesas they once grazed. One fire won't be enough to adequately thin the spreading brush and juniper. Fire will need to be a recurring presence, and it remains to be seen if both the civilian public and the Forest Service have the stomach for it over the long run. Prescribed fires don't always obey the boundary of their prescription, the most famous local example being the Cerro Grande Fire of 2000. Begun as a prescribed fire in the Bandelier National Monument of northern New Mexico, it escaped control and burned for a month before it was contained. The smoke plume blew so far east it could be seen over the Oklahoma Panhandle. 200 miles away, 47,000 acres burned, causing $1 billion total damage, including $340 million worth to the Los Alamos National Laboratories. The habitat of endangered spotted owls was incinerated. The town of Los Alamos had to be evacuated. More than 350 families lost their homes. Officials quibbled for years over what had gone wrong, and why, aside from the quantifiable destruction of property. The biggest loss may have been public confidence in the very notion of prescribed fire as a legitimate tool for ecosystem restoration, at least in the intermix zone of wildlands and homes. It's hard to win a friend for fire when you burn down his house with it. The Gila, though, provides a canvas on which to paint with fire that is superior to any other place in the Southwest. Indeed, if it can't be done here, it probably can't be done anywhere in the lower 48. Only a few tiny towns are sprinkled throughout the forest. The vast majority is uninhabited. Less than 0.5% of it qualifies as wildland-urban interface. The biggest town around, Silver City, with a population of 10.0, lies at the Gila's southern edge, and with prevailing winds out of the southwest, the smoke impact on humans is close to negligible. None of this means precautions aren't taken, down to the tiniest detail. As the writer William D. Bies has said, consider the alignment of stars. A burn boss on public land must achieve archaeological clearance, interagency consultation on threatened and endangered species, environmental analysis, survival of appeals, clean air permit, crew and equipment availability, weather window. A 1,000-acre burn can take a year or more of preparation. Even then, its chances of occurring in optimal conditions are slim. On this mid-April day in the Mimbres Valley of the Gila National Forest, the stars have aligned. Winds are light, fuel moisture is advantageous, neither to dry, which would make a burn dangerous, nor to wet, which would make a burn pointless. The fire goes off without a hitch, several hundred acres a day, and from where I sit it even looks rather beautiful, a soft white smoke rising off the tablelands, blown east over the Black Range crest before dispersing on the desert. In the third week of April, the snowpack having receded, the packers Les and Cameron arrive with the boxes I stowed in the shack at the saddle. They tie their animals to various trees in the meadow, and together we empty the mule's panniers of my supplies. When I shake Les' hand and ask how he's doing, he smiles through his neatly trimmed beard and says, "Living the dream, man, living the dream." Hard-handed and bow-legged, these men practice one of the great and dying arts of a world without roads, and over the course of my season their handiwork today will lessen the punishment my body takes in getting to the lookout. With a base of dry and canned food in place, I will resupply myself every 2 weeks with fresh fruit and vegetables, bread, chocolate, cheese, and tortillas. Their effort today is rather simple, just 2 men on horseback, each of them leading a single mule on a rope, with panniers holding my boxes balanced at each mule's side. I have seen them supply a big crew in rough country, however, where a single man may lead a string of as many as 10 animals, and it is a sight of calm and purposeful synchronicity sweet to behold, not least because the mules seem to enjoy it. We stack my boxes on the porch and share lunch in the warmth of the cabin. Less is enough food for 3 men. A feast put together last night by his wife, sandwiches, yogurt, cookies, homemade trail mix. He graciously offers me his leftovers. I consider most of what he brought a luxury here. I did not turn it down. You ever get lonely up here, Cameron? The younger of the two asks as he looks around the cabin. Nope, not really. You ever get, sad or anything like that? This requires a thoughtful response. Sad is too small and mean a word for the feelings this place evokes in me, yet I'd be lying to say I live here in a state of perpetual ecstasy, like the blissed outboat his tall Kerouac dreamed of becoming. On the other hand, I'm not about to tell the guys in leather chaps and cowboy hats about my very real and near mystical hours of longing and nostalgia, alone in my little glass box, brooding over and exulting in my own mortality amid mountains silently magisterial in the late day sun, nor the hours of sitting and staring into the inscrutable heart of the desert, not thinking anything, not feeling anything, neither happy nor sad nor any quantifiable mixture thereof, merely alive with a hungry retina and a taste for dry mountain country and a Jones for the sight of that first twist of smoke. The only time my heart sinks is when hikers show up, but it doesn't happen often and they never stay long. They laugh and look at each other, wondering, perhaps, if I'm trying to tell them something. It's no wonder our Forest Service brethren think of us lookouts as the freaks on the peaks. We have, in the words of our forbear Edward Abbey, an indolent, melancholy nature. Our walk home is always uphill. We live alone on the roof of the world, clinging to the rock-like corners, fiercely territorial. We ply our trade inside a steel and glass room immaculately designed to attract lightning. Our purpose and our pleasure is to watch, study the horizon, ride out the storms, an eagle-eye peeled for evidence of flame. Cameron leans back and yawns, rubs his clean-shaven jaw. The clouds have begun to spit sleet, compact little crystals flying horizontally on the wind, even as the sun shines overhead, though it's just a little squall, unlikely to last long. It serves as their excuse to get moving down the trail. I stand in the meadow and watch them descend through the trees. Les turns, offers a wave of his hand, and then they are gone. If I'm lucky, they'll be the last of my government colleagues to set foot on this mountain all year. From here on out the peak will be mine. The thought makes me smile, as does the knowledge that hidden in my boxes of books are 3 spare bottles of bourbon. On the last Monday of the month I hike in for the start of another tour, smelling along the way the sweet dry smell of pine needles in sunlight, the dog 50 yards ahead of me, both of us loafing along, finding our rhythm. No reason to rush on such a fine spring day. A beautiful morning in the Black Range for April, unusually calm. We're a mile up the trail from the saddle, just crossing a short ridge connecting to hills, when I see a globule of smoke curl out of a canyon bottom, a mile northeast and 1,000 feet below. Fire. Several thoughts occur to me in rapid succession. First, there is no relief lookout as yet on the mountain. On my days off, and I've been working overtime this far, 12 or 13 days instead of 10, with only a day or 2 off at a time, the lookout remains unstaffed. My boss having hired as my relief a student who won't be free until the last week of May. The absence of an Pucknean haze of drift smoke indicates the fire has just popped up. The color and the shape of the smoke tell me still other things. So by the time I drop my pack and key up my radio, Alice looking at me curiously, her head cocked to one side, I'm pretty certain I'm the only person on Earth who can see it. I also have a good idea of where it is, how it started, how big it is, and what sort of fuels it's burning in. A bit of guesswork I can indulge after 8 seasons in this line of work. Although my knowledge of the ways of fire has grown, my initial reaction to the sight of a smoke remains unchanged over the years. It's always a major kick. I take a couple of minutes to regulate my breathing and douse my sizzling nerve ends in the cold water of government professionalism before I press the transmit button on the radio. Otherwise I'd sound as if I were the thing on fire. Out of habit I call dispatch under the name of my peak instead of my last name, which causes them confusion given my location. More than once they request my azimuth reading on the fire. Before I finally get them to understand I am calling from the trail and not from the top, I tell them the fire is about a mile northeast of Wright Saddle, that it's on the east side of the Black Range, in a canyon bottom, about 1/10 of an acre or less, burning most likely on the ground, in grass, a small column of light gray, almost white smoke, with 4.5 miles ahead of me. I tell them to give me an hour and a half to get to the top, at which point I'll be happy to give them my Zimmy from the tower. Then I switch channels and call my boss to make sure he has a copy on all I've just said, and by talking it through him back in the office with maps, me standing on a boulder looking into the canyon, we put a pretty firm location on the fire. A little ways beyond the end of a road heading west out of Embry, near where a trail turns up Thief Gulch, thus, the Thief Fire. If you threw 100 darts at a map of the Black Range, you'd be hard-pressed to hit a spot more conducive to an unwanted fire. Brushy fields cover steep slopes at the confluence of 3 drainages, offering the fire ample compass and plenty of avenues to move. Fire has been ruthlessly suppressed in the surrounding country for 100 years, so fuel loads are unusually high. The rough terrain makes the area too dangerous to work with a helicopter, removing one tool from the suppression arsenal. The proximity of Embry, less than 2 miles east, adds private homes to the list of concerns. Were the fire to spread upslope to the west, it would begin to find thick pockets of dead fir perfectly poised to burn. Beginning in 2003, engraver beetles began to attack white fir stands on the southern end of the Black Range, resulting in an almost total mortality for that tree species over tens of thousands of acres. During my tenure, I've seen the needles of the firs to my south turn from healthy green to bright red, then become ashen gray and fall to the ground, leaving dead standing trees to weather and rot. Such beetles are endemic in western coniferous forests. The mountain pine beetle, for instance, attacks lodgepole pines and is responsible for decimating nearly 4 million acres of western pine forests in 2007 alone. At fir beetles, and the tally comes closer to 7 million acres. Bark beetles typically feed on trees already weakened by other factors. Occasionally, when forests become stressed by drought, overcrowding, or widespread root disease, beetle populations erupt into epidemics. This has happened on an irregular schedule for thousands of years. It happened here over the past half-decade. A forest overgrown from an absence of fire became further stressed by a period of drought. Too many trees competing for too little moisture. The beetles found thick, susceptible stands of white fir and bored through their bark. They laid eggs in little galleries carved in the space between the cambium and the sapwood. The eggs hatched and became larvae, which fed on the cambium, the living tissue that cycles nutrients from the roots to the rest of the tree. After a year, the larvae emerged as full-grown beetles and flew away to attack new trees. Only the eventual decimation of the host tree species can halt an epidemic, either that or a late hard freeze that kills the larvae. No such freeze has occurred here in years, so the beetles had their way until they killed most of the white fir trees over an area bigger than the island of Manhattan. About 60% of the more than 500,000-acre Black Range district has seen fire over the past 15 years, all of that to my north. In 2003, for instance, the boiler fire burned 58.0 acres. In 2006, the bull fire burned 80.0 acres. Such figures include the total perimeter of a burn. Inside the perimeter, many pockets of green remain untouched by flame, and even in the charred places, big, bold trees live on. These fires, the kind that burn slowly, a few hundred to a couple thousand acres a day over a period of weeks or months, create a mosaic of habitats that in their overall health and diversity help prevent bark beetle attacks. The one area of the Black Range still starved of fire is the country running from my lookout south to the forest boundary, precisely the area with the worst beetle infestation on the entire range. It's not difficult to grasp why fire was kept at bay here for most of the 20th century. There is, first of all, the presence of homes and cabins along the forest edge. A scenic highway passes by, and the tourists prefer green trees to black. The mountains here hold the watershed of 2 little towns beyond the forest, each of them perched astride the creek banks, and a fire would strip ground cover and result in rapid muddy runoff right down their main streets. The public angst likely to arise from the sight of flames and mud was judged not worth the risk. In my time, I've seen crews suppress at least 6 fires that could have grown huge to my south if left to burn. The consensus now, from the district ranger on down through the firefighters and even to us lowly lookouts, is that this corner of the forest is going to burn, has to burn, one of these years. It's only a matter of how and when. Maybe we'll get lucky with a late season smoke that hangs on through cool weather and even light rains, burning calmly for weeks, chewing up the deadfall and duff on the ground, torching through occasional dog-hair thickets of pine and fir, and leaving the mature forest partially intact. On the other hand, when the big one comes in this part of the world, the stage is more likely to be set by high winds, hot summer weather, and low humidity, followed by ignition from dry lightning or the careless human hand. A fire that can't be caught by anything but rain, no matter the manpower thrown at it. We see such fires with increasing frequency in the southwest. The Rodeo Chetty and Aspen fires in Arizona for 106.0 and 84.750 acres, respectively. The Hayman fire in Colorado 113.0 acres. The Bear fire here on the Gila 15.0 acres. Fires that blew through 10.0 acres a day or more and torched every last living thing they touched, leaving a charrscape in their midst. However it happens, I want to be here for it, partly out of a selfish wish for spectacle, partly because I've stared at the land for thousands of hours and feel I could be useful to the folks on the ground. With firefighters coming from between 40 and 120 miles away, no smoke jumpers available in the southwest just yet, I arrive on the peak about the same time the first crew of 5 reaches the thief fire. An airplane observer is up and circling, talking to the crew on the air-to-ground frequency. From the tower, I'm just able to see the top of the smoke rising above a ridge. It is my hunch, and it's only a hunch, that if I'd been on the peak instead of hiking in, I'd have been a half hour later in seeing the smoke. Pure dumb luck to have been where I was, when I was. The crew's first task is to locate the fire's origin and determine a cause. Whether lightning or human, much hinges on what they find. If it's lightning caused, my boss has several options. He can order suppression, he can put the fire in confinement status and wait to see how it behaves, planning to corral it several days out, or he can call it a fire-use fire and let it burn for weeks or months on end. If, on the other hand, the fire is found to be human-caused, his only option will be total suppression. For most of the 20th century there was no such palette of options. The Forest Service judged each and every fire a potential travesty and responded accordingly. This policy can be traced back to the agency's earliest days. In 1905, when President Theodore Roosevelt brought the nation's forest reserves under the control of the Department of Agriculture, he appointed his friend and fellow conservationist Gifford Pinchot as the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot, like Roosevelt a political progressive, believed the western forests ought to be protected from the baleful forces that had laid waste to the forest of the East and upper Midwest clear-cuts and fires, often in that order. The goal was not to preserve timbered lands as semi-wild getaways for that portion of the American public that liked dramatic scenery, that fell to the national parks. Rather, it was to impose a progressive era ideal of efficiency and rational use on the raw materials of empire. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, timber barons, railroad trusts, and mining concerns had mowed down vast reaches of mature timber to feed the nation's hunger for wood products, whether for housing, railroad ties, mine shaft supports, or fuel. Forestalling these interests, powerful as they were, was the easy part. Moving the forest to the public domain did much to inhibit their destruction, but one force proved a trickier enemy: fire. It had been a presence on the landscape for longer than big trusts and rapacious conglomerates. Free-burning fire, kindled by lightning, had been the norm in western forest for untold millennia. Its intensity fluctuated depending on variations in fuels and climate, flaring in drier epochs, fizzling in wetter ones. But as the fire historian Stephen Pine points out, wildfire has been a presence on Earth since the Devonian period, 400 million years ago, when sufficient oxygen for combustion flooded the planet's atmosphere. Once humans mastered fire, they wielded it liberally for their own purposes. They used it while hunting, to herd, confuse, and entrap their prey. They used it for farming, to clear the land of cover and fertilize the soil for cultivation. They used it in tandem with domestic livestock, to jumpstart regrowth on previously grazed grass. They even used it for gathering purposes, aware that light burning made way for acorns, wild raspberries, and other food sources. Sometimes their fires escaped and burned over areas larger than intended. The combination of lightning-kindled wildfire and human burning created a crazy quilt of flame-licked lands. So the landscapes gathered under the newly born American forest reserves had long been the site of a complex fire regime. With the coming of European civilization, fire's presence only intensified. Yemen farmers practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, dumping brush and grass back into the soil as ash and breaking up thick root systems in preparation for seeding with grain crops. Railroads threw sparks from their tracks and embers from their coal-fired engines, showering whole corridors of the West with fire. Loggers torched their leftovers, drifters, sellers, and prospectors lit fires by design and by accident. Campfires escaped. Mining towns burned into the surrounding hills. To early progressive foresters, all this fire on the land showed a promiscuous disregard for the nation's timber resources. Bernhard Furneaux, Pinch's predecessor in the division of forestry, considered this flowering of fire a result of bad habits and loose morals. Pinchot equated fire suppression with the earlier crusade for abolition. The question of forest fires, like the question of slavery, may be shelved for a time, at enormous cost in the end, but sooner or later it must be faced. On an inspection of Arizona forests in 1900, Pinchot rode horseback along the Mogollon Rim, looking over North America's largest continuous stand of ponderosa pine. We looked down and across the forest to the plain, he later wrote in his memoirs, and as we looked there rose a line of smokes. An Apache was getting ready to hunt deer, and he was setting the woods on fire because a hunter has a better chance under cover of smoke. It was primeval but not according to the rules. It didn't occur to him that what was primeval and what was the rule might be one and the same, and for good reason. The Great Fire debate commenced sooner than even Pinchot anticipated. In the summer of 1910, 5 years after Roosevelt had created the Forest Service, and a mere 3 years after he and Pinchot had added an additional 16 million acres to the national forest in a sweeping exercise of executive power, fires broke out all over the country, from New York to Oregon. The worst fires flared in the northern Rockies. In the national forests of Montana and Idaho, nearly 3 million acres burned, and that doesn't count fires in the surrounding national parks and Indian reservations, much less on private holdings or state-owned lands. 79 firefighters died fighting the biggest blazes. Whole towns collapsed in flame. Some estimates put the total burned acreage for the year in the tens of millions nationwide. 3 main arguments dominated the debate that followed. Some claimed the answer lay in light burning the Indian way, it was sometimes called. In an article published in Sunset magazine the month the Great Fires blew up, 3 civil engineers made the case for how fire must be fought with fire. They pointed out that California's pine forests had been burned by natives for centuries before white men arrived, and what white men found were healthy forests with open, grassy understory and accessible timber. By continuing such practices, foresters could make fire their servant rather than their master, lighting fires when conditions were favorable, in the cooler, damper weather of autumn, rather than fighting fires in the searing heat and squirrely winds of summer. Preemptive use of fire would protect against the kind of blowpus just then charring the northern Rockies. For those who opposed federal control of the forest, the catastrophic fires reinforced their belief that settlement was the only appropriate response. Development would reduce fire danger by threading the forest with roads, chopping the vast stretches of continuous fuel into more manageable chunks, by opening the timber to cutting, which would further starve fire fuel, and by populating the mountains with settlers, who could organize themselves to fight fire when it occurred. To the pro-development forces, and they included many powerful Western congressmen, the enemy to be feared wasn't fire, it was conservation. Senator Weldon Hayburn of Idaho claimed the big fires were God's revenge for not allowing industry to have its way on the land. He pushed a plan to remove the burned areas from national forests and hand them over to private owners. The Idaho press went so far as to suggest clear-cutting the northern Rockies as a defensive measure. It would really be better to cut down all the trees than to incur the imminent risk of such vast destruction and mortality as has been accompanied by these fires, for it is better to devastate forests than to devastate settlements. Pinchot and the Forest Service pushed back. They viewed such arguments as a means of undermining public confidence in the agency, which still faced opposition in Congress and an annual battle for appropriations. To usher in settlement or approve wholesale clear-cutting would defeat the very purpose of the national forest. To admit the efficacy of light burning would be to capitulate to primitivism, confusing the public. The Forest Service existed to preserve the public good, and fire destroyed the public good. What was required, in Pinch's reckoning, was a military-style assault on fire. 79 men had died in Idaho and Montana not for a misguided cause. They died because obstructionists in Congress hadn't provided them with adequate resources. With a system of trails, telephone lines, and lookout towers in place in the national forest, plus the promise of emergency appropriations to cover firefighting costs, early detection and rapid response would give firefighters a decisive advantage. Fire could be banished, relegated to the history books. This argument won the day, prevailing for 60 years. It had the virtue of simplicity. All fire in all forests was evil and must be stopped. It reassured the public that the men who'd perished in the big blow-up had not died in vain. In fact, they were the first martyrs in a noble crusade. With the trauma of 1910 seared in its DNA, the fledgling Forest Service had a defining purpose around which to rile. Dissenting voices would be marginalized for decades to come as the agency deployed its shock troops throughout the West to wage its ruthless war on fire. The fact that roads, trails, telephones, and towers constituted their own form of development did not trouble the sleep of Pinchot. He had always said that the first great fact about conservation is that it stands for development. To him, there were two kinds of development: the kind that destroyed the forest for short-term private gain, and the kind that preserved them for the long run. Fighting fire would preserve them for the long run. Decades would pass before the folly of this approach was finally acknowledged. Trails, phones, and towers would be supplemented with tankers, helicopters, and bulldozers, and the cost of fighting fires eventually would run beyond $1 billion a year. At a little past noon, the crew returns its verdict on the source of the thief fire: an abandoned campfire. No surprise given the absence of storms and the fire's location on a trail in a creek bottom, not far from a dirt road. Perhaps a couple of weekend turkey hunters broke camp hurriedly, confident a stone ring would hold their fire's embers in check. No such luck. Not this time. I have camped in heavy Black Range downpours, managed to get a campfire going, and found hot coals from which to rebuild it in the morning despite overnight showers, and the weather we've had lately warm and windy. Following on a dry winter, a pit of ash over coals can smolder for a couple of days, heating the surrounding earth until the pine duff around the stone circle ignites. At 12:40 Tony, the incident commander, calls his size up into dispatch. The fire is 10 to 12 acres now, burning in grass and pin and juniper, smoldering and making isolated runs, with flame lengths of 2 to 3 feet. Winds are light and variable, gusting to 7. Values at risk are private property holdings, the community of Embry, as well as some old mining shacks to its west. Potential for spread is high. Tony requests a heavy tanker for slurry drops and a second hotshot crew in addition to the one already on order. After signing off with dispatch, Tony dials up his crew on one of the tactical channels. I've reset my radio to scan. In order to eavesdrop, Jimbo's gonna mark off the fire's origin with some flagging tape. Make sure you've got plenty of water. I've got reinforcements coming. We're gonna need everybody to be heavy hitters on this one. By afternoon, 70 pairs of boots are on the ground. 3 hotshot crews and engine crews working furiously with chainsaws, pulassies, shovels, and rakes to cut and dig a containment line down to mineral soil along the fire's flanks. The goal is to halt the fire's spread by starving it of fuel, keeping it inside the line. The observer plane circles overhead, giving the updates on the fire's behavior. The observer plane pilot requests a ever total flight restriction over the area to 3.0 feet above ground level, in order to keep civilian and military aircraft clear of aerial operations over the fire. Guided on its drops by another aircraft called a lead plane, the tanker makes runs with slurry over the ridgetops, hoping to hold the head of the fire in check long enough for the ground crews to bring their lines along both flanks and tie them into the slurry. Every now and then a stand of thick timber torches, and a dark gray cloud of smoke rises into the sky. I turn away from the fire momentarily, undertake my periodic survey of the country in the other direction. To the north and west, I'm scanning the Pino Salos range through the binoculars when something big and black takes up half my view. It's on top of me almost before the sound of it arrives. An Air Force fighter jet. I don't even have time to offer my customary one-finger salute. I call the dispatcher, as is the protocol in such situations. Silver City Dispatch, Apache Peak. I've got a visual on a military jet headed due east over Apache Peak. Apache Peak, dispatch. We copy, thanks for the info. I switch to air to ground. Call the observer plane. Heads up, John. My tower just got buzzed by a military jet. We copy direct, in fact. We've got him in sight. Stand by one. While I'm standing by, the observer plane is forced to take evasive action. The pilot dives and turns 180 degrees. The wingman identifies the incoming aircraft as a delta-wing single-exhaust Torno jet. Hot dog flavos. Out on a training run. They love to fly the Gila. It's wild. It's rugged. Hardly anyone complains of the noise because hardly anyone lives out here. I see them a couple dozen times a summer somehow, though someone didn't get the message on the FR, and the results are nearly fatal, certainly way too frightening to mention in any detail on the radio, though no doubt the pilot and the spotter uttered choice words in that cockpit. Apache Peak, fair at a tie fair attack. Apache Peak, thanks for the heads up, buddy. They got real western there for a second. Copy that. I'd say he came within 200 feet of my tower. No excuse for that, or for blowing the FR. We'll make sure they get an earful over at Holland Air Force Base when we get back in tonight. Given how the culture of wildland firefighting, almost from the beginning, has borrowed its tools and tactics from the American military. It's no small irony that on this day a rogue Air Force jet provides the nearest brush with disaster. Around 4 o'clock the thief fire crosses the main creek bottom and begins to burn up the other side. The IV admits to the observer plane that despite their suppression efforts they may not catch this one. Don't know what to recommend to you. The spotter replies, "You're doing all the right things, but it's kind of a dog's breakfast down there." The IV calls me next. We know each other well, Tony and I. He's my boss second in command. Has been on the Gila 5 years. No need to mince words. We both know the score. If the fire continues to the top of the ridge on the north, it will eventually find continuous brush and heavy timber for miles to the west, including all the way to the top of my peak. "Phil, have you got your safety zones planned out?" Tony asks. "I've got options. The meadow is big and open and mostly grass. There's also a little boulder field where the deer have munched away all the vegetation, and of course there's always the cistern. I could drop down in there and tread water for a couple hours if it came to that. Well, we'd try to fly you out by chopper before then, but just think ahead a little for me. Safety's absolutely number one." "Copy that," I say. "Good luck down there." In addition to the options mentioned above, I have 3 others. I could simply stay in the tower, which rises far enough above the meadow to protect me, unless the trees to my north torch in flame lengths of 50 feet or more, always a possibility, in which case I'd roast in the tower like a chicken in an oven. I could light my own backfire, burning up enough of the meadow ahead of the main fire to rob it of fuel and allow me to lie down in the ashes. Or I could run to the cabin for my fire shelter, a kind of miniature tent of aluminum and fiberglass that reflects radiant heat and traps breathable air, allowing a human to survive inside of it while a fire passes over. None of these options is terribly attractive, and each would be a last resort in case a helicopter couldn't come for me. But with 3.5 miles between me and the fire, and prevailing winds working against it, the danger is far from imminent. I'll say this for my superiors. They mean it when they talk safety first. Last year, for instance, 26 firefighters died in the line of duty on wildland fires in the United States. It's an inherently dangerous line of work, and planning for maximum safety is always my boss's top concern. At 5:15 p.m., a second tanker arrives on scene, and for a couple of hours the two tankers trade off, working load and return out of Grant County Airport in staggered increments, dropping 3.0 gallons of retardant with each load, designed to coat vegetation in moisture. The retardant contains 85% water, 10% sulfate-based ammonia fertilizer, and a small amount of iron oxide to color the mixture red, so the pilots can see their handiwork. All radio communication on the fire is punctuated by the whine and roar of chainsaws in the background. When the observer plane returns to the airport for fuel, I take over as eyes from above on fire behavior. The crews continue to build line on the fire's flanks. It's my job to let them know if the color and volume of the smoke change. Every now and then it does. As fire finds brush and trees to torch, the crews report several slopovers, meaning fire has crossed their line and new line must be scraped to contain it. As dusk begins to fall, the fire cools amid rising humidity, falling temperatures, lighter winds. This is the moment of truth. With one last desperate push, the separate crews tie their lines into the slurry barrier, and the fire's growth is halted at 25 acres. There will remain several days of mop-up and monitor duty, not to mention a long night of patrolling line and culling off hot spots on the edges. But the battle, this time, has been won. The thanks the tanker pilots for their work and cuts them loose. The observer plane bids farewell, turns back toward the fire base. "You saved our bacon on this one." The spotter tells the tanker pilots, "That could have been 20,000 acres if things didn't go our way. Let's do it again sometime, but maybe not real soon." No injuries, no damage to property, no explaining to prying reporters why this one got away. All in all, the best possible outcome, at least from a public relations standpoint. The residents of Embry will sleep easy tonight, and once the crews are back in camp and bedded down around midnight, so will I.